Assad's regime have surrendered, just walked away, without barely a shot being fired.
What you've now got in Syria is jubilation. The Assad regime was utterly brutal, but a huge question mark of what comes next. If you're sitting at home listening to this and thinking, but what does this have to do with me? It's worth just going back a tiny bit over the history of what happened. Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the Newsagents live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester the following week on the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates. The link will be in the description below, and we're very excited to see you there.
The sound of celebration is ringing out across Syrian cities because suddenly, extraordinarily suddenly, a 24-year regime, that of President Assad, has come to an end. Right now, Syrian state TV is broadcasting just a single still image, and it reads, "The Great Revolution has triumphed and the Assad regime has fallen. History."
It is extraordinary. There is celebration, as Lewis was saying. But we've been here before in the Middle East. We have been here before in Iraq, in Libya, and other countries where it feels like something new is being born, but it's very uncertain what the shape of that future will be. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
And it is 12:20, midday on Sunday in London, and it has been eye-watering, the pace of change this past 24 hours, 12 hours if you like, where the Assad regime, which seemed solid for 13 years of civil war, has collapsed in a breathtaking 10 days, with no resistance being offered and the only gunfire being heard on the streets of Damascus today is that of guns being fired into the air in celebration that the brutal regime of the Assad family, which, Bashar al-Assad was 25 years, his father before that, has ruled the country with a grip of iron for over half a century.
It is extraordinary. I mean, this is why we're doing this show, special Sunday show, is because these events are genuinely momentous and historic. And it does seem weird, and I can understand, if you're listening to this and you know a little bit about Syria and the civil war that's happened since 2011, or if you don't know anything, the speed of it probably does seem breathtaking. And that's because it is. Because even this week, and just to give a little example, even this week, the Italian government was talking about opening a new embassy in Damascus. Most European governments have not had embassies there since the start of the civil war. That's how sudden and weird this has all been. We knew that there had been these Syrian rebel groups, which we can talk about a bit more about who they are in a moment, but we knew they were on the march. They were doing well. They had taken, quite surprisingly, cities like Homs and Aleppo, and there was concern and talk from the Syrian government about what would happen to Damascus. Yet I woke up this morning to the LBC show, 7 o'clock, flashes on the phone that it appears that Assad has fled Syria. And as John was saying, just to give sort of new readers start here a little bit, just to give a sense of the history of it, the Assad family have been in power in Syria as a brutal regime, authoritarian regime, since 1970. First Hafez al-Assad and then Bashar al-Assad. And, of course, the reason that Syria has been in the news most over the last 15 years or so is the Syrian civil war, which started in 2011. That was part of the Arab Spring at that time, where we saw young people in particular rising up, demanding new governments in old authoritarian regimes. And the Syrian government, under Bashar al-Assad, responded in the most brutal way possible. Millions of people were displaced and fled the country. Over 500,000 Syrians were killed in those 14 to 15 years with the connivance, and this is where we can broaden it out into the geopolitics, with the connivance and backing, in particular, of the Russian state, who carpet bombed, helped the Syrians carpet bomb cities like Homs and cities like Aleppo, and Iran in particular. And that is for all sorts of different religious reasons, which we can go into. But right now, we can say this has been a bad day for Assad, who we're told has now fled the country. Bad day for Russia, bad day for Iran.
Yeah, I mean, just a little ironic note that apparently Bashar al-Assad has told the Russians, who've put this out on Russian media, that he wants a peaceful transfer of power. Oh, really?
Cheers, mate.
Because you were so committed to peace when you were the leader and killing tens of thousands of your own civilians. But, Lewis, you talk about the geopolitics of this. You've got American-backed forces in one little segment. That the group that has swept away the Assad regime was backed by Turkey. And, you know, we talk about Iran being the regional superpower. Maybe it's time we start talking about Turkey as the regional superpower, because Erdogan's muscle in Ankara has been absolutely critical in the events that have unfolded. And Assad was dependent on Lebanese fighters, Hezbollah. Well, they've had their hands full with Israel. Iran also with its hands full. Russia hands full of Ukraine. And suddenly this regime that in some ways is not the most important country in the Middle East. It hasn't got the economic muscle of a Saudi Arabia. It hasn't got the military might of Iran.
Well, also, Assad's run it into the ground
and
over the last 10
run it
years.
into the ground.
Economically, politically, all of it.
But because of where it sits geographically, it is absolutely critical. I mean, perhaps the obvious country to compare it to is Libya. But Libya does not sit on Israel's border in the way that, you know, Syria does with the Golan Heights. And yet, the possibility of uncertainty now, you know, you kind of wonder sometimes in the Middle East when you look at the geopolitics, whether people just kind of, yeah, there are brutal dictators, but at least there's stability. You know, to some extent, America looks at it like that. Russia looks at it like that. China looks at it like that. What you've now got in Syria is jubilation. The Assad regime was utterly brutal, but a huge question mark of what comes next.
Huge question mark about what comes next. And what is extraordinary about watching the pictures this afternoon is the extent to which Assad's regime and his men and his army have surrendered, just walked away without barely a shot being fired. That's how brittle the regime in the end was. That's how little popular consent there was for this regime. Because it could easily have been the other way. It could have been a pitched battle, the sort of thing that we've seen over many years. And we should talk a little bit about who might replace him. And this is a group that you're probably going to hear a lot more about in the next couple of days, and is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short, the acronym. Now, this is a group which they're not the only part or not the only kind of component of the militias and the rebel forces who have now seized control of the Syrian government, but they are the primary part of it. And they used to be known as a Nusra Front, and that was a former wing of Al-Qaeda. And it was formed to oppose the Syrian government during the civil war and was founded by its leader, a man called Abu Muhammad al-Ghalani. Now, he actually did have connections with the group which went on to be a big part of Islamic State, of Daesh, which is one of the reasons why the United States government has designated HTS a terrorist group. So these are people, and they, you know, the concern is, the worry is, even though Ghalani and his group, they've been in recent weeks and months trying to moderate their image, trying to make clear that they want to be a government for all Syrians, which is a complicated patchwork of different religious groups, ethnic groups, everything ranging from Sunni to Shia to Alawite Muslims and Christians as well. Trying to make clear that they would be someone who would do business with everybody and not be sectarian in that way. But there is concern, obviously, particularly from religious minorities in Syria, that this could be another Islamist regime in the making, and it could become oppressive in Islamist terms. And there will be concern in Western capitals, of course, about what that looks like, what that new government looks like, and how it handles this, you know, deeply complicated country. I mean, yes, joy, jubilation, euphoria today, probably tomorrow, But then what about day 3? What about day 4? What about the hard yards of actually governing this country, of keeping the bins flowing, of keeping the schools open, all that sort of stuff, where we've seen this movie before, right? When a new regime or a new party comes in and quickly there is chaos.
Yeah, and look at the chaos that has already been caused by the civil war. And, again, if you're sitting at home listening to this and thinking, but what does this have to do with me? It's worth just going back a tiny bit over the history of what happened when the civil war erupted. Bashar al-Assad orders his troops to use chemical weapons against his own people. The pictures that came out from that were grotesque, of people choking on their own saliva. It was just, hideous, unspeakable. Barack Obama had said that would be a red line and America would act. But before that, the British Parliament voted, and David Cameron, then Prime Minister, wanted to back supporting military action that Obama was planning. Ed Miliband, newly elected or relatively recently elected as Labour Party leader on a platform of no repeats of the Iraq War, says no. And the British Parliament vote it down. Barack Obama suddenly finds himself cornered. He doesn't back it. And so a red line of the West goes unignored, emboldening Iran, emboldening Russia, weakening the West's moral authority in that region. And part of that was what happened in the British Parliament. And, I think we sometimes exaggerate the importance of Britain and its role in the world. Actually, I think on this occasion, what Britain did in voting down military action against Syria did have massive consequences worldwide.
And there are, again, and there will be, really big geopolitical and international implications, not least if things go wrong. There are already millions and millions of Syrian refugees around the world. The border this morning has actually been full of Syrians trying to get back into the country, desperate to go back from countries like Lebanon, from Turkey, and indeed further afield. But of course, if things go really wrong, if there is a miscalculation, if there is a descent into further ethnic or political conflict, or indeed there is a resurgence in a hardline Islamism, then those refugee flows will start again. And we will be back into the sort of conversations that we were in, which convulsed European politics, partially led to Brexit, of a huge migratory crisis that we saw in 2015, still having implications, for example, in German politics today, because Angela Merkel took so many Syrian refugees in, and so on. So you can feel the tension in Western capitals. On the one hand, pleased that the Assad regime has gone, no friend of the West, big ally and courtier of the Russians and of the Iranians, but of course nervousness. And I was asked the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner about this, about how the British government intended to handle this morning. Obviously Britain only a relatively minor player in these things, but obviously representative of the wider question. This is what she said.
If the Assad regime has fallen, then we do welcome it, and we want to see stability in the region. So working towards the UN resolution with our allies to make sure that the people of Syria has the stability, and of course making sure that they're protected, and so is the infrastructure.
Should we be concerned that the founder of HGS, the main rebel militia group, Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, was once a participant in the Iraqi insurgency against the US involved with ISIS, a member of a group that eventually became Islamic State? Should we be worried about that?
We don't want to see terrorist organisations. We want to see a democratic government there, and we'll work with our allies to ensure that we can work within the UN resolutions to deliver that.
But do we consider al-Jalani a terrorist?
Well, again, like I say, we're working with our allies and through the UN resolution to deliver peace in that region, and terrorist organisations will not deliver peace.
Yeah, Angela Rayner obviously I'm not going to commit myself on that, Lewis.
Very careful.
Very, very careful, and rightly so. And of course, there has been, as you were saying a moment ago, he is trying to rebadge himself as the sort of Syrian nationalist leader, not as a sort of jihadist or, leading a kind of revolution in that way. And I think, we'll wait to see what, as I say, we're recording this at 12:30. It's 7:30 in the morning in Washington. We haven't really had any comment yet from the State Department, from the White House, other than they are watching events closely. One person who has spoken out, of course, Donald Trump. Donald
No.
Trump, who was in Paris yesterday for the fabulous reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral, saying, we should stay out of it. Let the pieces fall as they may. This is nothing to do with us. Keep America out. And so, again, will other countries stay out of this when there is going to be a geopolitical battle over the shape of it? And what comes next, we'll consider in a moment.
I think that point you were talking about just a minute ago, John, about how the US responds to this is really, really interesting, because obviously the fall of Assad has been, in one way or another, albeit not a very aggressively pursued one recently, but basically US policy or Western policy certainly did not approve of the Assad regime, certainly did not approve of how it became a key suitor of Russia and Iran. But obviously this is happening at quite an awkward time in terms of American politics. Because, right, we're in the heart of the transition period. We're in the dying weeks, embers of the Biden administration. And Trump is coming in, and they have very different ways of seeing the world and seeing this. And there is clearly potentially an opportunity. I mean, you can't... I was talking against it to Malcolm Rifkin, former Foreign Secretary, Conservative Foreign Secretary, on the LBC show. And he was saying, and I think rightly, it's actually hard to overstate what a calamitous blow this is in terms of power in the Middle East for Iran and, to a lesser but still significant extent, Russia. This is a repudiation of them in so many ways. They have, over the years, invested so much power and prestige and resource in this ailing, brutal, vile regime. And that has now gone. And there is the potential for a retipping of the balance. A tipping of the balances, by the way, that probably to some extent has only happened because of wider events, right? What's one of the reasons Russians decided to put less resource and material into what's gone on in Syria and supporting the Assad regime? Because they've been so bogged down in Ukraine. What's one of the reasons that Iran has had less resources available to it to devote to Syria? Because it's been bogged down with what's gone on in Gaza and Israel and supporting Hezbollah, who themselves have been extremely diminished. So this is all connected in terms of the geopolitical events and the big picture historic events that we've seen unfold in the last couple of years. It's just meant that as a result of that, partly, we've all taken our eye off what was going on in Syria and how it was connected.
Do you remember Obama saying about Russia that it was a regional superpower? It wasn't a proper superpower. It was
really
a regional
pissed
superpower.
Putin off.
Which really pissed Putin off. And so when America failed to act after Assad using chemical weapons, Russia saw an opportunity. They were old allies, and Russia suddenly saw the ability to get a firm foothold in the Middle East, which it took with alacrity. And I should imagine the degree of humiliation in Moscow is intense, that has come to nothing and they are playing no part. But when Donald Trump says, look, let the pieces fall as they may, we have no interest in what happens. Well, yes, you do. I mean, you have come in and said you are going to be an extremely pro-Israel administration. If you get an Islamist IS-style grouping taking over in Damascus to Tel Aviv is about 200 miles. It's about a 4-hour drive, if you could drive it. It's not far at all. To have a country with chemical weapons in unstable hands on Israel's border, Israel would see as a threat. And that could lead to further instability. Now, all the time that Bashar al-Assad was there, he was never going to fire his chemical weapons at Israel because he'd know that Damascus would be flattened. But if you have got uncertainty, or you have got different rebel groups in different areas, in the way that Libya sort of became balkanized itself, then you have the potential for huge uncertainty, in which case America most certainly will take an interest. Or if they see Iran trying to move in and, to extend the Islamic Republic to Syria, there will be interest from America. So I just don't believe it's that easy for, Donald Trump to say, nothing to do with us.
No, it's not. And the Israelis have already moved this morning extra troops, extra forces to the occupied Golan Heights, which was previously Syrian territory, now Israeli, although disputed. Precisely this reason, because they are concerned and already expressing concern about, and we saw this happen after the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, in a time of instability when the government is still being formed, and suddenly all of these weapons, which are just around, which were previously obviously protected by the regime, what happens to them? We know that Assad has chemical weapons, because you say, John, he used them against his own citizens in the early part of the Syrian civil war. So there are really big implications in every direction, and certainly for Israel. And of course, we can't ignore as well the religious element to all of this, right? Because this is a part of such a long-standing intra-religious conflict within the Islamic faith, which is that, the Sunni Shia split, and you have Iran, which is Shia, Hezbollah in Israel, which is Shia, and of course, Assad, who was and is an Alawite, which is a sort of sect of Shia Islam. The new force, or the new regime in Syria, is going to be Sunni of one form or another, so that plays into sort of wider regional conflict. So you can see that this has all sorts of implications, and it is easy to get almost lost in how dazzling those implications could be, and to lose sight of, for so many millions of Syrians today, both in country and outside of country, this is a day that's a little bit like, or this sort of Syria's Berlin Wall moment. That is how it sits, and is deeply moving and worrying at the same time. And on the show earlier, on the LBC show, I spoke to Suhaib Jeba, who is a Syrian journalist. He himself was forced to flee the country, initially went to Germany, then to the UK because of his work as a journalist. He himself tortured by the Syrian regime and by the Assad regime, and his family as well. And you could just tell from that conversation how much this means.
I don't know how to describe my feelings actually, but what I can say is it's a glorious day for the Syrian people. Today, the souls of the victims who died under torture in Assad's regime prisons will rest in peace. Today, also the refugees, the displaced people, over 15 million people around the world. Now they will have hope again. They will have hope of safe homeland and a promising future. Today also the Syrians will live with dignity and freedom. Only dignity and freedom. That's what we asked for from the beginning of the Syrian revolution. Only dignity and freedom, and now we achieve it. Today also justice will be achieved. Only today Hamza and Hajar, the children who started the Syrian revolution, their souls will rest in peace as well. Not only them, but also the souls of almost million Syrians were killed by the Assad regime, the criminal Assad regime. Today, the international community must achieve the transition justice by persecuting the war criminal Bashar al-Assad, who's hiding, by the way, now.
And I think what Suhaib says there about the fate of Assad himself is fascinating, because we do not know where he has gone. Millions of Syrians will want him tried. They want to see him, his family, his generals, the wider apparatus of his state put on trial. And of course, many would dearly like to see that happen at the ICC in The Hague. Now, we don't know where he's gone. There is speculation that he's fled to Russia, in which case we'll probably never see him again in one form or another. He'll certainly not end up at the ICC. But an astonishing, can you imagine, looking now at my laptop, I'm looking at pictures that have just been released of seeing rebels inside the presidential palace, sort of just wandering around, having a good time, smashing up a few things. As far as we know, Assad was there as recently as this week, or certainly if not this week, very, very recently, still the president of Syria. And now we don't know where he is. There is every possibility that if he goes to the wrong place, there are very few people who will welcome him and his family, that he could end up on trial, watching the pictures of these people, presumably that he completely abhors and despises, in his home that was his even this morning.
And this is where, although what we're trying to do on this podcast is trying to talk about the wider geopolitics of it, there have been this morning so many, excuse the bad language on a Sunday, me moments where you just, I saw the video of someone driving around his garage, and you've got 90% of Syrians living below the poverty line. One of the reasons the army didn't fight is apparently they are undernourished, haven't been fed, haven't been paid. There was no motivation to go and fight.
It was the most corrupt regime imaginable. He'd driven it into the ground economically. It was utterly corrupt, utterly venal, no love for it from almost anybody.
And you see this garage full of Mercedes, Ferraris, Porsches, and you just think, God almighty, this still repeats itself again and again. These self-serving dictators who think they have a right to rule, and they plunder the nation's resources for their own ends. So it's no wonder that people are feeling utterly good riddance to Assad and his ghastly family. But, there will come a moment where somehow people are going to have to make decisions about the future. I've heard the Prime Minister, the outgoing Prime Minister, saying that he wants to see free and fair elections take place in Syria.
Funny that, isn't it?
Funny that this sudden, well, I was going to say Damascene conversion, but that would be
Very
too obvious.
appropriate.
Very appropriate. But this sudden Damascene conversion to democracy as he faces arrests by the rebels who have taken over the city. It's unbelievable.
Funny how keen people can be on elections when they're not going to be in power anymore, isn't it? Very, very odd. We will be back just after this.
Well, we will be back tomorrow, where I feel pretty certain we'll still be talking about this US reaction to what's happening and what, of course, is happening in Damascus itself.
The speed of it, I can't keep coming back to it, is astounding. I'm just looking now that the Syrian Foreign Ministry has posted on X a statement where they basically, Syrian brothers today, a new page is being written in the history of Syria. I mean, it's a very 2024 kind of way of looking at it.
Watch this space.
But the foreign minister, even already, the apparatus of the state, including the Syrian foreign ministry, again, which the entire apparatus of the Syrian state has been controlled by one family for over half a century, and then in a flash, in a kind of blitzkrieg type attack, it is all over and it's all gone. And we don't know what comes next, but it is whatever happens next, we can be absolutely assured of one thing. It is history, and it is going to be momentous for everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.